Hey there, students. So before you check out my presentation on feminism, I just ask that as you entertain what I am speaking about, you hold an open mind. And you know what? Like, you might disagree with what I have to say. I know feminism in the year 2020 is a very hot button issue for some guys and for some females, right? There's a lot of very caustic stuff out there on the issue of feminism. But just again, have an open mind. And you know what? If you disagree with me, that's okay, because that's how freedom works. We're allowed to disagree, right? If you think that women are in fact treated fairly in society and that they have full legal equality and political equality and social equality, then that's great, right? Then that's great. We've achieved what we should have in the first place, which is equality between men and women. All I'm asking is that you give what I talk about a serious bit of thought, right? That's all I'm asking. So anyways, I miss you guys. I wish that we could have this chat together, right? I wish that, we could have us sitting down together and sharing our opinions and our stories, because to me, that's what makes social studies really rich. And this experience, this crazy journey that we experience called life, is so much richer when we're able to share with other people. But that's just not something that we can do right now. So anyways, yeah, forward we go. Feminism. Legitimately, let's talk about this. Look, I'm gonna be honest. I'm a guy. I don't know what it's like to be a girl. I just don't. Although I have been married to one for almost 15 years, as I mentioned before, and I do have 2 daughters. So despite growing up in a household of men, other than obviously my mother, it has been an education for me in all things feminine, and it's been amazing. It's been awesome. Okay, so what we're going to do here, folks, is we're going to talk about the ideology of feminism. So let's get rolling along. So first of all, what is it? How do we define what feminism is? Very simply, guys, feminism is the movement for social, economic, and political equality between the sexes, right? For male and female people to be treated as equals, socially, politically, and economically. Now, what is feminism a reaction to? Feminism is a reaction to what is known as patriarchy. This idea that most societies are male dominated, right? That's generally the definition of patriarchy. Now, when we've been in a more traditional classroom setting, I've asked my female students if, they think that life would be easier, right? I just kind of throw it out there. Any ladies in the room, do you think it'd be easier if you were born a guy? Would life be easier if you were born a guy? And I'll tell you what, I personally think that, when I look at myself in the mirror, I am like the epitome of like socioeconomic win. I am a heterosexual, white male, right? Like, life is pretty good for me. And I think if I was a woman, I don't know what it's like to face sexism or to be objectified. Maybe I've been objectified. I don't know. But I've never faced overt objectification. I've never faced overt sexism, nor have been threatened by it, right? Like, I've been told by many young ladies in my classes before that they're afraid to walk alone at night, and nobody should ever feel that, right? Like, if humans are all equal, then that fear should not be something that people have to deal with. And then the last point of the slide here, by the way, I think a lot of women think that life would perhaps be easier if they were a guy, or maybe I'm wrong, right? I hate to generalize, but if I had to choose whether I was a boy or a girl, I would choose boy, right? And Beyonce even sings a song, right? Doesn't she have a song called If I Was a Boy or something like that? I don't know. I know that she made a song, something about this issue, right? And just so you guys are aware, this, in talking about feminism, right, it's not a liberal versus conservative issue. It's more of a human dignity issue, right? Freedom should be something, and equality should be something that all people feel and experience and are entitled to and are endowed with. Yet, for a long time in Western society, Canada, the United States, Great Britain, right, and other countries, women were not treated as equals. And that is a historical fact. Have we made strides in how women are treated? Absolutely. But I would argue today, in the year 2020, right, it's when I'm recording this on the 16th of April, 2020, things are definitely better for women. However, I think there's still a ways to go. So it's not a liberal conservative issue. It's a moral issue. It's a humanity issue. And while we have made strides in Western society, I mean, you look at some other societies throughout the world, and women are still treated horribly, right? When it comes to things like acid attacks and honor killings and things like that. Like, it's horrific to see what is happening to women in different areas of the world still. So let's move on here, guys. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so yeah, a definition, excuse me, of feminism. So it says, I'm better. So feminism is a movement that strives for equality between women and men. Pretty simple definition, right? And it is an advocacy for women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes, right? The big thing that we're going to look at in this presentation is how women fought for political inclusion, and we're going to look at something known as the suffragette movement. Now, can a man be a feminist? I guess so, right? Like, if by definition, right, feminism is the push for political, social, and economic equality between the sexes, well, if you believe in that, I guess technically you're a feminist, right? Our prime minister claims to be a feminist, right? As a Canadian, my prime minister, Justin Trudeau, the honorable Mr. Trudeau, he claims to be a feminist. Now, whether that claim is necessarily true, I'll let you determine that. But anyways, yeah, let's move on. All right, so the next 5 or so slides is just looking at some good old-fashioned sexism that we used to see in advertising back in the day. And these advertisements are reminiscent of around the 1950s, right? Around the 1950s. So this is an ad for a mixer, right? For the Kenwood chef. And it says the chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for, right? That idea that, a man's job is to go out and make that money, and a woman's job is to be in the home, raise the kids, and, right, basically wait hand and foot, or wait on a man hand and foot. Now, if you read that article, hopefully you did, with the little intro module, one module above this, you would have seen the Good Housekeeping guide to basically a woman's role in the home. And of course, the last point of that is a woman always knows her place, right? So there you go. All right, this one. This is actually an advertisement for pants, for crisp pleated pants. And it shows the woman being walked on, right? And I guess that's what happens when a woman sees a crisp pleat in a man's pants. She just falls to the ground and becomes walked on by the man. So yeah, the insinuation of this is rather interesting. I love this one, right? So most men ask, is she pretty? Not, is she clever? Because of course, what guys want is a pretty but stupid woman, right? So I don't want a clever woman, right? I just want her to look good. I don't want anything intelligent to be coming out of her mouth, right? Like, we don't need that. So hey, here's the good news. Palmolive soap, right? Palmolive soap will be what makes her clean and pretty and add to her allure and her air. Okay. Next one, the mini automatic for simple driving, right? Because I guess it's too difficult for a woman to steer and clutch and shift, right? Like, I don't know how many of you have ever driven a manual transmission, but look, women, we don't have to worry about this because we have the mini automatic for simple driving. Look how stressed she looks behind the wheel. This looks very, very challenging. So thankfully, right, Mini, right, the auto manufacturer back in the day, right? I don't know if you know the Austin Mini, but they got your back, right? They're gonna make a automatic transmission for you. Yay! And then whenever I see this image, I always think of my grandmother, right? God rest her soul, my Scottish grandma, my Scottish grandparents. On my dad's side, my grandparents were both from Scotland, as was my dad. My grandmother was born in Aberdeen, Scotland. My grandpa was born in Glasgow, Scotland. They met, and then they emigrated to Canada in around 1956, right? A year or so after my dad was born in Scotland. And I'll tell you what, as a byproduct of the 1950s, this was very much my grandmother until the day she became ill with cancer and then eventually passed away. My grandmother waited on my grandfather hand and foot. And you know what? If that's what my grandmother wanted to do, more power to her. Although she was also an accountant, right? She worked for the county of Strathcona. I remember as a kid going into the county of Strathcona building, and they used to have I don't know if they still do, but they have a spiral staircase, and just being in awe of what was going on there, and going upstairs into my grandmother's office, because she was a controller for the county of Strathcona, a very wise lady, and despite the fact that she was a career woman, she did all the cooking, right? I never ever saw my grandfather cook. She also did all of the cleaning. She did all of the grocery shopping. My grandfather, God rest his soul as well, was a kept man, right? I never saw him cook. I never saw him clean. I never saw him do laundry. And when my grandmother ended up passing away first, my dad and I were very, very worried about, whether my grandfather was going to be able to be honest, survive, because my grandfather, he didn't even know how to turn on the washing machine inside their house. And for a long time, all he was eating was cans of soup because he didn't know how to cook anything, right? He didn't know how to do any of that because for the entirety of his adult life, it was my grandmother who did it for him. Now, was that because of societal expectation? Maybe, right? Was that because of the fact that my grandmother loved my grandfather? Absolutely, right? But I guess, guys, what the feminist movement is trying to say is that it's okay for women to be something else, right? And women should have the choice, not the expectation, but the choice to be more than what you see on the screen here, where she waits hand and foot for her man. All right, so a little bit of history about the early roots of feminism. So guys, the roots of feminism go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, right? And we have talked about this in this class. We know that in the early to mid 1800s in originally Great Britain, right? And then it spread to other places in the world. We had this revolution of mechanization where machinery replaced human labor. Now, these machines needed people. And what happened was men went and did these jobs for various reasons, right? And women stayed in the home, much as you see right here. And as men went out and did gainful work, right, they got paid, and that economic power that came from being paid eventually translated into social and political power. And men were the so-called breadwinners of society. And a lot of people argue that this is what contributed to the sort of, I guess, the roots of the patriarchy that we see in society today. And, you know, if you look at statistics, and we'll get to those, it is suggestive today that even in the year, 2020, women in most Western nations still, for the same work, same education, make about 80% of what a man does. Like, all things kept equal, right? Education, experience, all that kind of stuff. And this idea of lack of equality begins with the Industrial Revolution. So men went out and worked, they made the money, and that translates to power in the home. And women basically, tended the children just like they always have, right? They were relegated to the domestic sphere. Now, by the late 1800s, we start to see this, men being the breadwinners, men having the power in society. We start to see it become challenged. And again, we see the rise of something known as the suffragette movement. The word suffrage means the right to participate in the politics of a society. Basically, what we're talking about here when we talk about the right to suffrage is we're talking about the right to vote. And in the late 1800s in Great Britain and in other countries as well, right? In the United States, there was a large suffrage movement. Here in Canada, right? In the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was also a large suffrage movement as well. But it primarily started in Great Britain. And why? Well, guys, Great Britain was where we start to see a lot of these philosophers that we spoke about when we talked about classical liberalism, right? Again, classical liberalism, the foundation of any liberal ideology is the idea of freedom. And the people who identified as suffragettes, right, the ladies who are part of this movement, they demanded the right to participate in society when it came to politics. They wanted the right to vote. Why? Well, because women were in most nations up to this point disenfranchised. The word disenfranchised, you see it here on the slide. The word disenfranchised means to not be allowed to participate in primarily politics, right? So they were lacking the ability to vote. And I want you guys to understand that the suffragette movement is what we consider today to be the first wave of feminism. Now, there is a link here at the bottom of the slide. Please watch it, right? It gives you some amazing context to the suffragette movement that we saw in Great Britain. All right, next slide. So this image here shows us some women who would be considered to be suffragettes. Now, just so you're aware, women protested for the right to vote, right? Women, as you should have seen from the video, if you watched it already, women actually put their lives on the line. Women were beaten and jailed for the right to vote because men were like, why are these women acting this way, right? And of course, let's face it, guys, talking about power structures in society, right? Why would men be threatened by women having the right to vote? Well, if women gain the right to vote, what other rights are they going to gain? And that's a threat to male dominance in society. And I would argue that a lot of the backlash from males when it came to women being able to vote was because they were worried about losing their position of privilege and prominence in society. So another image of suffragettes, right? So it says to ask freedom for women is not a crime. Suffragette prisoners should not be treated as criminals. So as I mentioned, right, some women were actually jailed. Many women were actually jailed for protesting, for demonstrating for the right to gain the franchise. Now, here in Canada, there is a group called the Famous Five, and these ladies, right, and their names are Irene Parlby, Emily Murphy, Henrietta Mere Edwards, Louise McKinney, and Nellie McClung, right? That's the ladies that we see here on the screen. They today are known as the Famous Five, and there's actually a foundation named after them here in Canada that looks to continue to empower ladies. And guys, here in Canada, the Famous Five, they're considered to be sort of like pioneers of the feminist and suffragette movement, and their fight focused on something known as the person's question. Now notice, please, again, there is a link on the slide here that you should check out. So it gives you a little bit more context than what I'm going to give you here. Anyways, according to the British North America Act, which of course in 1867 made Canada into a country, the BNA did not recognize women as persons, right? The BNA said that only persons were allowed to participate in our democracy, to have the right to vote. And as a result of women not being considered persons here in Canada, they were disenfranchised. And these ladies would not take that as an answer, right? To think that women aren't persons. If women aren't people, I mean, what are they, right? Like, it seems kind of silly when we talk about it now, but this is a historical fact. So they went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada, or the highest court in Canada, I don't think it was the Supreme Court at this time, said, no, women are not persons. They basically rejected their petition, and then these women would not be deterred. They sent a petition to the Privy Council of Great Britain, which at that time was the highest court in Canada, right, being a part of the Commonwealth, right? And eventually they reversed the court's ruling and included women in or as persons. And then eventually, right, we see women in the early 1910s gain the right to vote here in Canada and in federal elections, and then eventually we see women gain the right to vote in provincial elections as well in the late, in most Canadian provinces in the late 1910s. So it happened first federally, and then it eventually happens provincially, where women can participate in their provincial elections. So eventually women gain the right to participate in politics, which is good, right? Which is good. Another important time in the feminist movement was during World War II, where, of course, men went off and fought, and a lot of the industries that had men as workers were suffering, and women went into the factories and filled that void. And you can see the poster right here of this lady by the name of Rosie the Riveter, right? And, this is an iconic piece of feminist art, right? And it says, we can do it. Like basically saying that women can do everything that men can do. And this really demonstrated that women were capable of doing what was considered at that time to be man's work or men's work, right? And here on the next slide, we have an image of a so-called Rosie, right? And I think actually the Rosie the Riveter painting, right, that you saw, or the picture, right, the art that you saw in the last slide is actually based on this very woman. At least I believe it is. To me, the likeness is very similar, right? And she's doing something here which, as you can see, is rather untypical female work, right? Or at least it was back in those days. Number one, she's smoking, right? Not quote unquote feminine at that time. Although, to be honest, the cigarette, right? If you look at the word cigarette, right? Cigarette, E-T-T-E, right? The suffix of that word, et implies female, right? Suffragette, right? Suffrage for women, right? Cigarette, right? A cigar for women, right? So it's just a different nicotine delivery device. Anyways, I mean, she's working on a great big gun, right? A weapon of war, which again, we don't typically think of, or at least at that time, as women doing work like this. And for the most part, they weren't even welcomed to do work like this until the men were off fighting on the fronts of the Second World War. All right, now, fast forward now into the 1960s, we see the rise of the second wave of feminism. And this is what we typically think of as the women's lib or the women's liberation movement, right? The women's liberation movement. And there were a number of issues surrounding the women's liberation movement. I'll just flip to the next slide. So while in the 1960s, women had gained the right to vote, right? The suffragette movement was successful in doing that. There were still a number of issues in society that feminists felt needed to be addressed. And I am by no means an expert in this. But some of the issues that women were still focused on included things like, sexuality and whether it was okay for a woman to express her sexuality in public, familial issues, is it okay for a woman to go out and have a career rather than having a family and raising children, workplace issues such as, blue collar versus pink collar jobs, which of course still exist today. When I say pink collar, I'm talking about jobs which are typically done by females, right? When I say typically, right, like jobs that when you think of, you think that's a woman's job, right? Such as, elementary school teacher, secretary, flight attendant, things like that, right? Hairstylist. Now, reproductive rights, also another issue, whether or not women should be taking things like birth control pills, other issues surrounding things like abortion, right? And then lastly, the issue of marital rape. This one's... So in a lot of American states, and I'm not sure about the history of it in Canada, but in a lot of American states, if a man wanted to have sex with his wife and he said no, it was legal for a man to rape his wife. And yeah, so that was a bit of an issue, right? Okay, let's move on. Now, today in the year 2020, we face the issue of pay equity, right? On this slide here, we have and this is a Canadian source, by the way. It shows what the average income of a male is in Canada at $69,800, and I think these stats come from about 2018, and it shows what the average pay of a female is here in Canada at $51,800. Now, look, I know that there are differences in education. There are differences in the jobs that men and women typically do. But the next slide addresses that a little bit more. So we have a man here on the left making $70,000 a year, and a woman on the right making $35,000 a year. Now I know what you're saying. Well, who cares, right? I mean, the man makes more because he's more educated and he's been doing the job longer. Actually, no. As it says at the bottom, it says these two operations specialists both work for a tech startup in Toronto. They were on the same team and had the same amount of experience, 1 year. She was promoted to a supervisor role, but left soon after the job in tech. Or for another job in tech with fairer compensation. So this lady made, considering having the same experience, half of what a man did in the same industry, in the same workplace. So guys, online, there's a lot of misinformation about pay inequality, right? I know that it's in men's best interest to try to propagate the myth that women are paid the same as men. But the fact of the matter is, guys, women today make about 80% of what a male does when you consider similar education and similar experience. And to prove that, I'm going to click on this link here and open up the website here, which is the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this is from a 2018 report. And it says in 2018, women who are full-time wage and salary workers had median usual weekly earnings that were 81% of earnings of a male's full-time wage and salary, right? So guys, to say that this is an untruth, well then, I mean, here is evidence of a U.S. report from the U.S. federal government, right? A Department of Labor report stating that, in fact, it is true that women are paid less than men, right? And while there's other mitigating factors that explain why women make less than men, it is nonetheless a truth. Now, we have this image here, right? So we have a dad who brought his daughter to work day. I used to love bring your kid to work day, right? I remember going hanging out with my dad, going for like lunches and stuff like that. It was pretty sweet. So anyways, we have a dad say to his young daughter, I brought you to the office today, honey, to show you what you could look forward to if you were a man, right? I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the Fortune 500 companies or not, but the Fortune 500 companies are the 500 wealthiest corporations, highest grossing corporations in the world. And I should have checked the stats on this, but before I did this presentation. But last time I looked, the number of female CEOs that we see in the Fortune 500 is very, very small. Like it's not even 100 out of the 500. I think it's not even close to 100, to be honest. And the question is, why? And what this cartoon is trying to get at is this phenomenon known as the glass ceiling, right? How women, when it comes to organizations, only make it up so far, right? Before their advancement is stifled, and typically it is men in those high-powered positions. I mean, how many female prime ministers have we ever had here in Canada? I'll give you a sec. How many? That's right. One, right? And her name was Kim Campbell, and she was in power for, I believe, about 9 months. How many female presidents have we had in the United States of America? That's right. 0, right? So, I mean, is that a symptom of the glass ceiling? Perhaps, right? Is it maybe that women are unambitious and don't want to be in those positions of power? I doubt it. So is there something perhaps more at play? Possibly, right? Possibly. So the status of women today. I'm dating myself here, right? This is Britney Spears on the screen. And I wonder to myself, is this empowerment or is this objectification, right? Is this a woman using her sexuality and making mad bank because of it? Or is this a woman who's been told to dress this way by some male record exec because if you want to be a big star in the pop music scene, this is what you have to do, right? I'll leave that with you to think about. Also, this idea of girl power, right? I honestly think that, and these are the Spice Girls, by the way, and this is more from when I was a young man, right? They always champion this girl power thing, right? Meanwhile, you have a mature woman dressing as a sexualized young child, which is strange, right? So anyways, I think this whole girl power movement that we see, or that we at least saw in pop music and movies and things like that back in this day, was more so a marketing tool that made record execs, who are probably male, very, very wealthy. And then, of course, we have good old Nicki Minaj, right? And again, is this objectification or is this empowerment? Again, I'm not sure, right? Is this a woman who is secure in herself, flaunting her sexuality, or is this a woman who knows that she will not have the same number of hits if she doesn't sing about the type of music that she sings about, her anaconda, right, or the anacondas or whatever, and walks around in her video gyrating and things like that, right? So we've had in the past some former diploma sources, as you can see, that are all about this idea of feminism, right? The right to vote and stuff like that. And then we've also had this as a former diploma exam source as well. And these individuals are cheersing to, yay, equality in the world today. But as you can see, hopefully, the cup of the minority. We're going to look at the civil rights movement in the US with the next module, right? So the minority has a smaller glass. I'm assuming that this is a woman. You have a pink shirt and you have painted fingernails, right? And then you have a man. And if you look, his cup is larger, no doubt representative of the fact that men still have the power in society, or at least would say Clay Bennett, right? Clay Bennett is the author of this political cartoon. Yeah, so anyways, guys, that's sort of a quick crash course on feminism. Hopefully, guys, you've watched the videos. And again, I'm doing the movement no real justice here, right? I am not an expert on it, but I do believe that there are still strides to be made in society when it comes to equality between men and women. Are things a lot better than they used to be? Absolutely, right? Absolutely. I have no doubt that things are a lot better in society for women. Are they perfect? However, absolutely not, right? I do not believe that we have achieved full equality for women. So anyways, yeah, hopefully you learned something. And peace. Love you guys. And we will talk to you later.